Hello, I'm happy to share an article that came out recently from System Risk Services and their CEO, Matt Luscombe. He provided some great groundbreaking information in and around the use of the HCM data loader and HCM spreadsheet data loader processes. We're going to cover his article and a few comments as we go through each of his points from our perspective on how this should be analyzed and controlled. So Matt in this article identified 4 risks. Changes being performed within the HCM loader do not identify the individual performing the change. This is kind of one of those interesting issues we find where the integration between HCM and the security module doesn't properly display the user that is actually doing the activity. In this case, a generic user is being displayed in the audit logs. The second issue is changes to the HCM auditing configuration cannot be identified. So it's possible that a user with access to the configuration screen can turn off the auditing, use the HTML process to enable auditing again. In other words, there's no audit policy behind the scenes on the auditing configuration, or what we refer to as HCM auditing configuration. Third, even with the configuration properly done, the HCM data loader process allows a user to override audit settings, turning off auditing when they're loading individual batches. And the next issue in general, from a role design perspective, is there's many out of the box roles that have access to both the HCM data loader and the ability to manage the configuration screen. So we're going to talk a little bit about the risk of having access to the HCM data loader process if it would never be appropriate for somebody to use that, given the potential for overriding the audit logs or bypassing the audit logs. And then also the roles that have access to the HCL configuration screen if the intention is to turn that functionality off. So this is the configuration page that Matt identified in his article that allows a user to permanently bypass the audit policies by setting the enable audit data override value to yes, as shown here. By default, that override value is set to blank. It can be made either no or yes. In this case, yes means it would allow them to bypass the audit logs as part of the use of these 2 solutions. So Matt goes on to make 7 recommendations to address these risks. They're presented in this slide. Step 1, document if and when the user would be authorized to bypass the audit policies. It's important for management to identify if this functionality would ever be authorized. If there are cases where the bypass of the audit trail would be appropriate, it needs to be clearly identified and properly controlled. Step 2, hopefully you already have audit policies enabled for activities such as adding employees, making changes to salaries, and other high-risk activities in your HCM system. If you're also using ERP Cloud, hopefully you've also done the same for other modules such as General Ledger and other key financial supply chain and operating processes. Step 3, set up the audit configuration as is appropriate for your organization based upon the policy we talked about in step 1. When would it be authorized, if ever, is defined by management in the policy in step 1. We will look at this. We looked at this just recently in the last page, the configuration related to that audit policy. We want you to control. Step 4 is you want to control who can manage audit policies so your control environment cannot be undermined. We cover this point in detail in a post in July and then did an update to this post in September. I invite you to review that post and we'll provide a link to it in the last slide. Step 5, another form that needs to be controlled tightly is the one that determines if users can bypass the audit log. That's the one we looked at in the screenshot prior to this. Step 6, it would be appropriate to run a sensitive data access analysis to identify what roles currently have access to the ability to use the HCM data loader and HCM data loader abilities, as well as who has the ability to change the configuration we looked at in the prior slide. You may need to do some role redesign to remove roles altogether or privileges from certain roles in order to effectively mitigate these risks. Step 7, with the audit logs in place, if they are in place, using the audit policies and other processes, an IT quality assurance process needs to be put in place, or your current process needs to be extended to this process so you can validate that any changes to configurations have been documented and approved as part of your change management processes. Matt mentions 3 enhancement requests in his article that are necessary to support these objectives. All 3 are critical in the long run for Oracle to provide to allow organizations to more effectively control these risks, and we will provide a link to these 3 enhancements on the last slide. Keep in mind that seeded and custom roles cannot be disabled. This means that you cannot prevent one or more of these roles that contain these privileges from being assigned. Your user provisioning process has to be perfect to address these risks. Ideally, to implement the controls we've talked about, you should be able to disable roles in certain privileges like we've discussed. These are both enhancements that we've logged in Customer Connect for Oracle to consider. We will provide a link to these 2 ideas in Customer Connect on the last slide. Again, what we're calling for from Oracle's perspective is to allow us the ability to disable roles that perhaps would contain things like the ability to use this process, the data loader process, and potentially even disable the privileges altogether. This would allow us to reduce our risk perspective, or our overall risk portfolio. So there's a lot of manual controls that could be considered as part to help the mitigation of these risks. So I'm going to talk about these from an internal audit perspective. Whenever we see these types of risks, we're looking for mitigating controls to help identify whether there's manual mitigating controls that could be helpful to address these risks. To keep this video to a minimum, I'm not going to go through each of these one by one. These are all potential mitigating controls depending on how your system's defined and how these controls are defined and how they would be implemented. Let me know if you'd like to discuss any of these manual mitigating controls in more detail. Be happy to have a one-on-one conversation with you and your organization. Here's the link to the full article and Matt's contact information. I encourage you to reach out to Matt directly with any questions or if you need any services to help address these risks. And finally, here are the links I mentioned throughout the presentation. The first one is our Securing Your Audit Policies video. This would be advice and guidance over audit policies, enabling of those and securing those in general. The next 3 are links to the enhancement requests I mentioned in Matt's article. Matt mentioned these in his article that need to be put in place to more effectively monitor and manage the risks in and around the HCM data loader process specifically. And the last 2 links at the bottom are enhancement requests I mentioned, the ability to disable roles that should never be assigned to anyone, the ability to disable high-risk privileges that you would never want a user to have access to in production. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at jhair@erpra.net or make a comment on either our YouTube channel or LinkedIn channels where this will be posted. Have a great day.